Chapter 2. The Ghetto. Ever since the German invasion, Vladka heard rumors that the Jews of Warsaw would be forced to move into a ghetto, and in the summer of 1940, those rumors proved to be true. German officials forced teams of Jewish workers to build a 10-foot-high brick wall around a designated area of about 1.3 square miles. This small enclosed area was to be the Jewish ghetto. Construction of the wall was completed in November, and all of the Jews of Warsaw were ordered to leave their homes and relocate inside of the ghetto. Volodka, her parents, and her siblings piled their belongings onto a hand-pulled wooden wagon and walked down the city's cobblestone streets. Progress was difficult. All around them, hundreds and thousands of Jewish men, women, and children were making the same journey to the ghetto. Volodka and her family arrived at the brick wall that separated the ghetto from the rest of the world and wheeled their belongings past the wooden barricade. There had already been Jewish families living inside of the Jewish quarters that was now isolated behind the ghetto wall. With so many more families forced to relocate there, the small area became unbearably crowded. Volodka and her family went looking for a place to stay in the ghetto. The best they could find was a tiny apartment on the third floor of a crumbling building. Volodka thought back to their comfortable 3-bedroom apartment, and now she, her parents, and her siblings would be sharing one room, a filthy kitchen so drenched with moisture from the leaking water that she could write her name on the wall with her finger. Volodka exchanged looks with her family. They knew things were only going to get worse and feared that eventually the Germans would kill them. They just didn't know when or how. For the moment, the family's main concern was making enough money to buy food. Volodka left the tiny apartment and wandered the streets of the ghetto, searching for an opportunity to earn some money. She saw tables and chairs laying the sidewalks that displayed shoes, shirts, socks, pots, pans, mirrors, cups, plates. Some people were selling cups of coffee. Others hung belongings from the windows, including bed sheets, blankets, and winter coats. Children had set up displays of toys and candies, anything at all that might bring in money for food. Whatever the Jews of the ghetto owned, they were willing to sell. She noticed that Germans guarding the entrance to the ghetto were allowing non-Jews from outside to come in and shop. So since the Jews are selling everything they own, the Polish Christians must have thought, why not take advantage of their misfortune and buy goods at a bargain price? As she went on, Volodka peered inside the entrances to the buildings and shuddered. In almost every doorway, she saw people young and old, emaciated and dying of starvation. When she returned to the tiny apartment, her family swapped reports of the day's activities. Her father had tried to sell some cloth from the shop they once ran, but German police robbed him of the goods and beat him up. Her sister, Hanaya, had found work in a public soup kitchen. Chaim was too young to work. He would stay home to help his mother with the cooking and cleaning. Volodka explained that she had found a job as a cashier in a barber shop. It paid next to nothing, but every little bit helped. Even with everyone trying their best, there was barely any money and very little to eat. Her mother was constantly depressed over their situation, and as the weeks went by, she watched her father also fade away slowly. He grew sick with pneumonia and hunger. It was impossible to get any medicine, and his depression only worsened his condition. He was the kind of person who lived with the shame of failing and providing for his family. One day, he turned his head to the wall, closed his eyes, and died. That was the first time she witnessed death up close, but it would not be the last. Chapter 2. Warsaw Ghetto. As an interim step between persecuting Jews and killing them, the Nazis forced the Jews out of Europe to move into congested slums they called ghettos. There was more than 1,000 ghettos in the Nazi-occupied countries across Europe. The largest was Warsaw Ghetto, which housed nearly 500,000 people. 30% of the city's population compressed into 1 square mile of buildings inside the ghetto. Nazi soldiers terrorized these Jews. They helped themselves to anything of value they possessed, beat them up, and even shot them. Starvation was a part of their strategy for eliminating the Jews of Europe. The official daily quota of food for the Jews in the ghetto was only 400 calories, the equivalent to 2 slices of bread and a little butter. But later, the Nazis reduced it to 200 calories per day. No one could live on so little, and the ghetto residents supplemented their starvation diet by smuggling food from outside the ghetto. Much of the smuggling was done by children small enough to squeeze in and out of the sewers and other openings in the brick wall. Few people in the ghettos had any income. Trading was a common means of getting food, but there was little food available, even for people with something to trade, and the death rate for starvation and lack of medical care spiraled. Between October 1940 and July 1942, when deportations began, more than 90,000 residents died, nearly 20% of the entire population of the ghetto. Taken away. For 2 years, while struggling to survive inside the ghettos, Vladka and her family heard reports of deportations. The reports describe German soldiers storming into the homes of Jewish people without any warning, rounding them up and sending them by train to concentration camps, where they were tortured and then killed. Still, even in the spring of 1942, such reports just seemed nothing more than rumors. By July 1942, Vlatka had moved into a tiny room in a separate apartment. One morning, she heard a commotion in the street below her. She rushed down the stairs and elbowed her way through the crowd of people. They were all gasping and moaning over the announcement that had been posted on the wall. So recently, the ink was still wet. By order of the German authorities, all Jews of Warsaw, regardless of their age or their sex, are to be deported. Only those employed by German workshops, the Jewish Community Council, the Jewish Police Department, and the Jewish hospital will be exempt. Every deportee will be permitted to carry no more than 15 kilograms of luggage, including cash, valuables, and provisions, to last 3 days. Those failing to comply with this edict will be subject to death. Vlatka stared in horror. It's true. The next phase of the Nazis' plan is to murder us, and it has begun. Her sister was still working in the soup kitchen, and Vlatka now had a job as a seamstress in the Tobin's sewing factory, which made clothes for the German army. Because Vlatka and her sister had these approved jobs, for the moment they were safe from deportation. However, her mother and her brother did not. Vlatka heard that some people bribed their way into an approved job while others purchased forged work papers, but either of these options would cost a small fortune, and her family had no money. She noticed that within a day of the deportation announcement, the poor and the sick disappeared from the streets of the ghetto. They knew they were of no use to the Germans and would be the first ones sent to their deaths, so they had gone into hiding. The only solution for Vlatka's mother and brother were to do the same. The best places to hide were in lofts, cellars, or tiny spaces behind walls or under the floors. One night when the ghetto streets were empty, she brought her mother and brother to the soup kitchen where her sister worked and hid them in the cellar. She knew they would not be able to stay there very long. People were coming and going from the soup kitchen all the time, but it might work for a few days. The alternative was to do nothing and wait for the Germans to deport them, but that was too painful to imagine. She'd heard terrible stories about the concentration camp Treblinka, where soldiers sent most of the Jews from Warsaw. These reports from prisoners who had escaped and returned to the ghetto haunted her at night. She'd hidden her mother and brother just in time. Deportations began the next day. That morning, as she left her apartment to go to her job at the sewing factory, she saw army trucks pull up on her street. German soldiers jumped out and stopped people at random. They pushed anyone without valid paperwork into the trucks. Anyone who tried to resist was immediately shot. Students, can you imagine what that would be like now, even though this was only 70 years later? Mass deportations, where if you don't have your paperwork, you're immediately put into a van or shot. Could this happen again in America? Are there people who are saying that they are going to do this as soon as they take office? Think about that. A few nights after the deportation, when Vlatka felt it was safe, she collected her mother and father from the cellar and hurried them back to their apartment. Then she returned to the small room where she lived. The following morning, she was awakened by gunfire in the streets below. She heard the crash of falling glass and people screaming. There were heavy footsteps on the stairs of her building and loud banging on her door. She knew it was another deportation by the Germans. Downstairs, everyone, and be quick about it. She threw her some clothes, grabbed her work permit, and hurried downstairs. In the street, she was surrounded by people running and pushing, everyone holding on tightly to suitcases and bundles of clothing. Parents and children were clinging to one another, and she saw grown-ups pleading with police to let their families stay together. The officers consulted papers listing who lived in which buildings and shouted out their names. Vlatka was caught up in the rush and pushed this way and that while frantically looking around her. Where were her mother and brother? Had they been taken? She knew her sister Hanai was at work, so at least she was safe for now. Have your paperwork ready for inspection. Vlatka watched German soldiers and Jewish police examining people's papers and ordered them to either the right or the left side of the street. Those who were sent to the right were lucky ones who had valid papers and permits and would be allowed to go home. The unlucky ones, those without work permits, were sent to the left side of the street to await deportation. She noticed that for many, even having a work permit meant nothing. I'm going to read that one again. Vlatka noticed that for many, even having a work permit meant nothing. If a soldier didn't like the way someone looked, that was sufficient reason enough for the soldier to kill them. She watched an old man, bent over with age, approach a soldier and show his papers. The soldier pushed the man's hand away, hit him hard on the head with the butt of his rifle. He staggered and fell to the ground. Vlatka felt herself losing hope. What would become of us, she wondered. We're nothing but objects, forced to do whatever the Nazis order us to do. What difference does it make if I live or die? Whatever is going to happen, right? I just want this to be over. She scanned the crowd on the opposite side of the street, hoping to see her mother and brother among those awaiting deportation. Hoping not to see them. Officers with drawn pistols were pushing the condemned onto the trucks and streetcars that would take them to the train station. She thought she heard her brother's voice calling from one of the streetcars, but she couldn't be sure. Everyone around her was screaming out the names of relatives. It was hard to hear anything. Hours later, the sun setting, but many who had been caught in the roundup were still waiting to be processed. Volodka recognized a man named Julian Walentskowski and his wife and child. Before the Nazi occupation, Julian had been her teacher in school. In the last few years, she had seen him work day and night to organize classes for children in the ghetto, and now she watched as he showed his family's papers to a German officer. The officer looked at him, noting with disapproval his glasses and scholarly demeanor, and waved the papers aside. "Left," he ordered, sending the teacher and his family to their death. She watched another neighbor present his family's documents. "Man to the right, wife and child to the left." The man pleaded with the police officer not to separate them. He nodded in agreement and pushed the whole family to the left for deportation. Oh, this is hard. When Volodka's turn came, she showed the officer a note that authorized her to work at the Tolbians clothing factory. Everyone knew the Tolbians. It was the largest German workshop in the ghetto. "How do I know this is a valid work card?" he demanded. "Look, there's my name. I'm the assist to the factory. To the right. Safe." I got to go with the safe ones. One by one, the trucks and streetcars departed. After a few minutes, the streets were quiet and empty, and Volodka watched soldiers sidestep bodies, rip open abandoned suitcases, pocket money, silverware, anything else of value. Around her were the corpses of Jews who had been shot, beaten. She looked up and saw others who, like her, had been spared thanks to their work permits. No one said a thing. They all stared in the directions where their families had been taken away. And then she heard someone say, "Well, at least the rest of us have been spared." A question that had been simmering inside her for weeks boiled over. There are only a few Nazi soldiers and several thousands of us. Why has no one, including me, done anything? Why are we all going to die when we are all going to die anyways? Why don't we fight back? But there are no answers, no more screams, just a growing awareness for Volodka that the total destruction of the Jewish people had begun. And due to luck or chance or some reason, she, from tens of thousands who had been processed that day, were among the small handful still alive. Now she had to find out if her mother and brother had somehow survived as well.